Hello, and welcome to the second day of the UK Crime Book Club's festival. We are joined today. It's been a bit of a change up, so we've given Sam the day off, and I've taken over hosting duties. My Rise Up the UK Crime Book Club list is taking off. Neil Lancaster should be joining us. He's having internet troubles, but we are joined today at the minute by two very fine writers of police procedurals, which is the topic of the panel. So if I just introduce them, and then we'll get into it. So on my left, I don't know about yours at home, is Alex Walters, who is the author of the DCI Moraine books, the D.I. Mackay books, and the D.I. Annie Delamere books. Hello, Alex.
Hello there.
Did I get that right, all the pronunciations?
You did, I think, yeah.
I'll take that, and we'll get into, obviously, more of that later. And on my right, we've got Gytha Lodge, who is the author of She Lies in Wait, Watching from the Dark, and Lie Beside Me, featuring the Jonah Sheen series.
Hello.
Hello, Gytha.
Hi.
Gytha's very kindly interrupted a cycling session to join us today, so we thank you very much.
Pleasure to be here.
It's nice to see you. So, first of all, police procedurals. Does anyone want to take on the what is a police procedural?
Shall I start?
Go on.
I think for me, I mean, the police procedural genre is really about. I mean, first of all, it's a series which involves. Hi, Neil.
Hiya. Sorry, I was having I don't know if it's a bit of black eye. You're the other side of the black eye, Mike. So I don't know if you're having the same problems, but I had a bit of a struggle there.
Yeah, I think we've got a good broadband on this side of it. So.
Yeah, you see, you Northerners. Sorry. Carry on.
We just started to talk about what a police procedural actually is. You're probably the best person to describe it, really, with your own background.
Well, yes and no, because I'm a firm believer in story trumps all, and it is really nice to let the reader think that there's accuracy within what we're writing about, and that it does reflect true life. But it's not possible. It's just purely impossible because, police work is just really dull most of the time. Who's going to watch in the morning if, whoever comes into the office and logs on the computer and sits there cataloguing unused material for the next 8 hours? Because that's the reality. And the bigger the crime investigation, the more sort of relevant that is. But to me, story trumps all. And I think we're getting it as right as we can is in the characters. It's trying to not be line of duty and to make it how cops really are and to make the cops plausible as opposed to the minutiae of forensics or things like that. So that's just my take on it. Is that, yeah, absolutely. If I can make it accurate, I always will. But if I can't, I'll make something up. And I think that's what we've all got the right to do.
Yeah, I think so.
Go for it.
Sorry, Chris.
Go away.
So
On you go.
I think that's very much the way I've ended up seeing it. After I think I was trying very, very hard with my first couple of books to make them as real as possible, because I know there are things and topics that I know about, and when I read something in a book which doesn't get them quite right, it frustrates me. And so I did a lot of talking to various officers and was trying very hard to get it right. And then I think two things happened. One was that I realised that actually I'd still made mistakes because I didn't know enough sometimes to ask the right questions. And that's just always going to be something that counts against you if you don't do that job. And the second thing was that after I wrote the first draft of my second book, there was this great comment from my editor about 40 pages in saying, like, you have just told us about 4 times now how boring police work is and made the reader sit through loads of sort of like headache-inducing CCTV scrolling. It's like, maybe that's not what people want to read about. And I was like, oh yeah, that's a really fair point. And so I cut quite a lot of it and decided that maybe that wasn't the right way to go for the good of the story. So yeah, I think that's a very fair point.
But I think there's quite easy ways round it. Is that you can give a nod to it so that you've let the reader know that you've thought of it, that it's there. So in some things I talk about in the most recent book, where they get authorities to go and deploy all sorts of covert tactics and all that sort of thing. Now, there's a hatful of work that sits behind that. It can take weeks to get that going. I mean, it can be done really, really quickly. But you can just give a reference to it, like, right, you can go and get the authorities in place and then leave it at that. You don't need to talk about it. Then the reader will then think, well, they've thought about it. And that, I think that's kind of enough. You get too bogged down in it. And it was something I did to start with in my early books, because I wanted to show off that I knew loads. So I talked too much and in too much detail about certain things. And I think you sort of can leave a fair bit more up to the reader. They tend to be a pretty smart bunch sometimes.
I think a lot of it is a sort of sleight of hand that you do, isn't it? Which is to try to suggest there's this big sort of iceberg of activity going on below the surface, and what
absolutely
is, top 5% of activity that's going on that's featured in the book, as it were. And I think a lot of what we do is that trickery. And I think in terms of accuracy, for me, it's what you don't want, something going to stop the reader in their tracks, thinking, well, that would never happen, So I think as long as it's plausible, as long as it feels like something that might happen in real life, then I think, generally speaking, that will be acceptable to the reader.
Absolutely.
About the precise detail of how that's done, or whether it takes 3 weeks or 24 hours to get this report back, or whatever it might be.
Have you had any reader feedback about something that you have written where they're like, no, I don't believe that, or that's not plausible, or anything like that? Yeah, once, Neil, you're nodding.
Once, twice, actually, very, very recently. And in the current book, I'll put my hands up on this one, and it came very recently from an ex-Scottish cop. Because, of course, I'm in the realms of now writing a Scottish crime series, but all my experiences in England, and the laws are quite significantly different. And I made reference to someone being charged with GBH, grievous bodily harm. Well, in Scotland, that's not on the statute book. They just have assault. And obviously the assault, it's all down to sentencing ranges depending on severity of injury, but they don't have specifically assault, as in GBH or ABH, things like that, or woundings. It's just assault. So yeah, people will. And this guy, he was really complimentary about the book, said he really loved it. And it's great because I said, great, can I run things past you then? So I've got, an invested reader who's willing to give me a hand as well, which is, a great resource to have.
It's worked out. What about...
it's terrific when that happens.
Yeah. Have you had anything back from readers, Gytha?
So, sorry about the tractor background. It's like a convoy of tractors. It's great. I had a really quite useful chat with someone on who'd attended a small kind of Zoom, basically saying, did you know, so how are you checking stuff? And I was explaining that I was doing it all through, originally through some police officers and then now through one particular one. And she was saying basically because as a forensic, she herself is a forensic scientist, and she sort of spotted something which I knew I'd got slightly wrong in the first one. I tried to correct later. The net result was that she then said, well, if you have any questions about the forensic side, why don't you message me? Because I'd be really happy to help. And that's perfect. It's someone sort of saying, oh, here's a small thing that I thought might help. Not saying it made me angry or I hated the book, but just saying, that was slightly out and here's how it really happens. And then saying, in future, just drop me a line, which I just loved. It was just such a nice thing. And because I really would like, to get the processes right where possible. And particularly when there's no reason for the story why they shouldn't be right. I'd like them to be there if I can. So I thought that was great.
Yeah, it's a really nice way to approach it. Alex, what about you?
I think I might have been contacted by the same ex-Scottish cop that Neil was actually at one stage. We had a very similar. I mean, I have a similar problem to Neil in that I've got 2 of my series are set in England and follow English police procedure, English law, and so on. I've got one series set in Scotland. So I always have to remember which one I'm writing at any given time in terms of the legal context and so on and so forth. And I've certainly had, certainly with the Scottish one, I had a couple of comments from people sort of saying, I can't even remember what the detail was now, but it was points of terminology, I think, that were different. And we just wouldn't say that in Scotland was the feedback. And that's great because again, you do, my sort of background is that I worked as a kind of sort of business management consultant for quite a long while. And I ended up by accident specialising in sort of criminal justice kind of areas. So spent a lot of time working in police forces. So I built up a sort of network of people that I can send the books to and get feedback and so on and so forth. But as Neil and Gytha have both said, it's always helpful to have more of those people who can look at your books and avoid you making those kind of mistakes if you possibly can.
Absolutely, yeah. Because I'm from Northern Ireland, so the police there just walk around freely with guns on their belts. So in my first one, she just had a gun all the time. So someone was like, "What? Like, it's just not right." So yeah, you do that. It's the geographical things really can mess with you. Neil, at the start you mentioned police work generally being a bit boring. Why have the three of you then decided to write police procedural novels? What was the calling? Gytha, let's start with you.
So I find true crime completely fascinating. I've always loved it. What I realised I liked about it particularly was the fact that you get to know all the kind of processes and intricacies of how a case is really solved. And I just realised that was something I was going to really enjoy if I wanted to do a crime novel, that I was going to really enjoy getting into. And combine that with the fact that if I was going to do a team of police and do it from their perspective, I could then revisit those characters over a whole series and not just have them appear for once and then wrap up. And I found that so appealing because I get really involved with my characters. I really like them, and they annoy me as well sometimes, and I want to see what's going to happen to them. So the idea of being able to just come back and back and back and keep revisiting was really just so attractive. So for those two reasons, it just seemed completely the right way to go.
Yeah, brilliant. And Alex, what about you?
The first three books I wrote were actually set in Mongolia, contemporary Mongolia, so completely different from the UK police procedural. They were sort of, I suppose they were sort of sitting somewhere between a spy thriller and a police procedural. But obviously, one of the great advantages about writing about Mongolia is there's only a handful of people out there in the UK who can spot if you make a mistake in terms of procedure. And then I sort of came to the end of that and started writing. And the first series I actually wrote was a series featuring a woman called Marie Donovan, who was an undercover officer working for what was then SOCA, but it's now National Crime Agency. And that was, again, because I've been doing a lot of work with the National Crime Agency at the time and had been talking to a lot of these kinds of people. So it's a kind of very fictionalised version of what had come out of that. So that's kind of where I started. And then I sort of moved from that into more conventional police procedurals. And I think for me, there are several things. One is I like writing series. I like being able to develop characters over a number of books and so on. I like writing about kind of people working in organisations, actually, strangely. I mean, I like the interaction and the dynamics of the way people work together and the tension, all that sort of stuff. So, and these procedures lend themselves to that, I think.
Yeah, that's great. And Neil, so your Tom Novak series wasn't police procedural, so what was the calling for Dead Man's Grave?
Well, I don't even know that it was, because my absence of ability to plot is shocking. I really am shocking at it, and I always end up with not what I expected. With the Novaks, I didn't get what I expected. They ended up being full-on thrillers, more influenced by Desmond Bagley and Alistair MacLean than any police procedural. So I didn't really know what I was going to get there. Now, when I set out with the Max Craigie book, Dead Man's Grave, that was all influenced. It was just the grave, which I've talked about, that I found in this ancient graveyard, the grave never to be opened. And I just thought, well, that's a great idea. There's something to start a book. And I didn't really know what I was going to write. And I still wasn't sure when I was writing it what it was going to be. I knew it wanted to be like the first of a series because I love the ability to write returning characters. And to me, the attractive nature of writing books with cops is that I know them. I know how to write them. I know what it's really like, and in terms of accuracy. As I get a lot of really good comments so far, which I'm so grateful for, about the interactions and the banter between the characters and the piss taking, because it's unrelenting, and that's what it really is like. It's nothing like Line of Duty, where everyone's just staid and weird and awful. Everyone is. It can be a brutal environment, but it can be a hysterically funny environment, and so that was always the point for me. It was about writing the characters, the relationships, and how they interacted with each other. And the story just led me down a path. And it turns out, and I didn't really appreciate it. In fact, I'm going to name drop here. It was Ian Rankin that made me crystallize this. When honestly, I was overwhelmed to have him read it and say nice things. But he said, starts out as a police procedural, but then morphs to a conspiracy thriller. And it just goes to show that I can't plan a book. I never know what I'm going to get until I write the end. So, yeah, I've ended up writing sort of half a police procedural. And half a thriller, and you know what? It's great. I love it, and I'm really happy with it. And that's kind of what I intended to do. I sort of thought I want to write a tartan noir book, but give it the heartbeat of a thriller. So I didn't think I was writing a police procedural until someone else told me I had. But it's fun.
Yeah, it's a great book. Character is massively important, because I think a lot of people, a few years down the line after reading a book, will forget what happened, but the character will stay in their head and keep bringing them back to the next in the series. So there's a nice question in the comments that sort of tied in with what I have. So Gytha, I'm going to start with you. How much did you know about your character before you started writing?
Oh, great question. So I definitely had to have him pinned down to a certain extent at the start. So Jonah Sheens is just marginally more the main character than Juliet Hanson, who's his constable, though it's sort of slightly flexes between books. But he's a DCI, and I want him to be more hands-on than a DCI really is, because it's more fun. And I also wanted him to be someone who was actually good at managing a team of people, rather than being sort of the guy who wants to solve everything himself. So those two things had to balance for me. But to be honest, he didn't really come alive and feel like a really solid person until I wrote, probably about a quarter of the way in, a scene in the interview room where he just suddenly tore someone to shreds. And I was thinking about where that comes from and what makes you good at that. And thinking about the fact that, some of the people I know who are best at being really horrific in sort of lines of questioning are people who are quite troubled. And I just had sort of realised that it probably came from his background. And so I actually rewrote him to be someone who had a father who was emotionally abusive and who was really very good at twisting what people had said, at attacking, at just going after them when he needed, when, not all the time, when he felt like it, when he wanted to be in control. And I just thought there was a lot of fun to be had in someone who would use that themselves in their work when they, again, felt they needed to, but didn't really quite like themselves for doing it. So, knew it made him good at what he did, but not have a very comfortable relationship with it. And then from there, he seemed like a real person to me. He seemed like someone who had a lot of sort of depth. So, yeah, so I guess a quarter of the way into the book is when I really met the real guy.
Oh, that's really interesting that you then went back and sort of gave him the tools and the backstory. It's really, really cool. And interesting that it took a quarter of a book to find that. It's really nice. Alex, so Annie's your latest series, is that right? And there's been 2 in that series, is that right?
Yes, the third one coming out.
Lovely. So how did you approach that character differently than the others that you'd written?
It was interesting. I started from wanting to have a female lead in the book, which I'd done previously with the Marie Donegan books. She then morphed into part of a broader team. So I wanted that sort of lead character, and it's actually. I mean, that was an interesting one because it actually emerged from a kind of discussion between myself and my wife, and I think one of my sons actually was there chatting about this when I was first starting to think about the series. And I gradually sort of built up this character who was she's married to a backbench Labour MP, a female Labour MP. Her mother is a former very senior police officer who's now retired and has become a sort of TV pundit, sort of gob on a stick type, talking about politics and wokeness and all those kinds of things. So that led me into the direction of a sort of fairly, they're probably more political books than any of my others, so they tend to do with political topics and sort of topical issues and so on. But I sort of built the character really from there. So I had that dynamic of the partner who had one set of politics, the mother who had a different set of politics, who was also a much more experienced police officer than Annie is, although with very different kinds of experience. And she's the sort of person that Annie would never be, I don't think, because she's never going to climb the greasy pole in the same kind of way that her mother did, you know. So it was that combination of things. And I suppose the other thing I tend to do is I write much longer than the sort of final version. So I tend to write scenes that are really for me rather than for the reader, where I'm sort of developing the character and I have interaction with the character. And I'll come to the end of that and think, well, that's great for me to know, because that gives me a background and backstory to the character. The reader doesn't need all that, so I end up probably cutting quite a bit of that background stuff just because it's, as I say, it helps me to understand rather than sort of the reader needs the story.
Ah, that's really interesting, yeah. And then Neil, Max and Tom, very different people. What was the sort of challenge of creating Max?
Well, again, it's an evolution with him. I wanted him to have some. I didn't want him to be as troubled as Novak, because Novak is really, really troubled because of his upbringing. Whereas I wanted him to have some difficulties. So I made him an ex-soldier and I made him have PTSD, but I didn't want it to be too in your face. I wanted it to be, because my background is military. My son's in the military. I hear these stories and things like that. And so I wanted that to be part of it. He does suffer from terrible dreams from Afghanistan. He does have these dark thoughts and these dark moods, but he's learned to manage them in his own way. He didn't find counselling helpful, so he runs with his little dog. And, he doesn't drink. He avoids all alcohol. He just drinks cranberry juice. It's just little things like that I don't know, but you get these little things like Reacher in his coffee. I just thought it's nice to him to have a little thing, and it's unusual. So I made him drink cranberry juice all the time. But I really wanted him, and he's quite introspective, but very much a trusting man. He's a much nicer man, I think. And he has his main sidekick, Janie Calder, who again Janie's very awkward. She's very green. She's on accelerated promotion. She's ferociously intelligent, but is finding her feet. She's finding it really hard. And it was really my editor that got me doing this, about developing them as a double act, and her evolution throughout the book as she gains more confidence and becomes more sort of competent. So it's about the relationships, I think, where I found it most interesting. And then, of course, we've got Ross Fraser, who is just the most fun to write of any character I've ever read, because he's bluff, he's crass, he's overweight, he's got gout most of the time, he's always falling out with his wife, and it enables you to put these little subplots in around the trouble he's having with his wife. I had to sort of put in a load on the second book, which he's going through edits at the moment, to build this subplot between Ross Fraser and his wife, who we never hear about. We hear about, we don't know her name. She's just Mrs. Fraser, he always refers to her as. And I just love that. And it gives me so much pleasure to write him with his foul-mouthed, abusive, scruffy, always got cut shaving and there's a button missing. And it was just, it reminds me a little bit. I was trying to go down the Mick Herron route a little bit without being overly stealing, But it's just huge fun to write these characters and huge fun to develop them and give them extra little quirks. Because my editor, Finn, at HQ said, I think you should make Jane quirkier. Give her something else. Give her a little, something that'll mark her out. He goes, something like a weird music thing. And I thought, I'm all over that. So, of course, that starts procrastination, doesn't it? So you start researching weird music. And I wasted, I think Mike, me and you had a little back and forth on freeform jazz, krautrock, all these things to build it all up. And, you can waste hours doing this and listening to this really weird 1970s progressive krautrock or Critters Buggin', this freeform jazz. But then that gives you all these opportunities for a load of banter, because when she's putting the music on and he's ripping the piss out of her. So it's the characters that made me go to police procedurals, because it allows me to build these dynamics and these friendships and these sort of people clashing and bumping up against each other. And it's just it's a laugh to write. And, I got loads of comments that people find it funny that the way these characters are. But again, it really is accurate, because that's what it's like. You get all these weird characters in the police force, all these strange. But I used to work with a bloke who had been a professor of astrophysics. he used to turn up to work in socks and sandals. Oh, I'm going to put him in a book. That's it. He's going in the next book. It's things like that. I know. Sorry, I won't waffle on too much about it, but that's what makes it for me. Is if you can get the relationships right and make them funny and interesting, and then that's what you can really hang a series on. I'll shut up now. Let somebody else talk.
That's a beautiful answer. Thank you very much. Marion Todd, who's on panel at 3, which we'll talk about in just a bit, has asked a really good question saying, are there any subjects you could not tackle in a crime novel? So anything that's taboo or that you couldn't touch yourself? Alex, what do you think?
I mean, I sort of got reactions to say no. I think there's stuff you couldn't cover. I think my core always is trivialising, very serious subjects. So I think, I think I found particularly with the Annie Delamere series, because I do tend to write about topical issues there. I've meant to be sort of careful that I'm not sort of underplaying the important sort of significance of some of those issues affected by them and so on. But you have to accept that responsibility. But I think within those boundaries, I don't think there's anything that I would feel is kind of really off limits. It would be a question of how you do it, and the way, whether you could do it in a way that was appropriate. I think. Yeah,
I agree. Gytha, what do you think?
So I'm definitely a big believer in how things are handled. I mean, it's with crime, it's such a weird thing that you are basically always writing about something pretty uniquely horrible, and that's what for some reason we've chosen to do with our time, and presumably we enjoy to read as well, which says a lot about us. But for me, my biggest focus is to make sure that you never lose track of the kind of the heart in it, that characters should never ever be just killed off because you need an exciting thing to happen at a moment in the book, that they're always mourned, that they're always real people. So I think probably that renders any topic something that's within bounds. But I do have a suspicion that, because I've avoided it so far, I think I find it very hard to write about a child murder, like someone really young. And I think maybe in the years before I had my 10-year-old, I might have found it easier. But nowadays, I've become this total wuss about everything. And anytime there's a disaster in the world, I'm just imagining lots of hymns being involved, and I just get incredibly sad about it. And maybe that's not being a wuss. Maybe that's just what we're supposed to feel like. I don't know. And maybe I was a bit of a psychopath beforehand. We don't know. But so that I think is one I would find. I think I'd find it really tough. I know I find it incredibly tough to read about, whether it's real life or whether it's fiction. So maybe that's one that I'll not attempt, at least in the short term.
Yeah, I'm the same. I've got a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old, and anything with children involved, I wonder whether or not to start it. If there's like a little shoe on the cover or something. Yeah. I'm with you. Neil, what about yourself? Is anything off limits?
Not per se. There are things I think I would tread very carefully around. And I think as writers, when we start to tell a story, you have to look at yourself and say, am I qualified to write this story? And I'm not just talking about crimes here. I'm talking about if there are certain subjects we need to be very careful around. And can I get it right? Am I going to really offend a group of people by talking about this subject? Do I know enough? Do I have the right to tell this story? I think we probably all ask ourselves that question before we set out to write. In terms of just particular crimes, there are some things I'll be really careful about, and I think anything to do with children is hard. You've got to be very sensitive, and I'm certainly not going to. I'd never describe a crime committed to a child. I wouldn't ever sit there and write that crime. I don't feel I don't see how I can do that without it being horrifying to me, and therefore probably will I do it justice when I write it. So I'm not saying I'll never write a book where there are children involved, but it's about how I treat it. I don't know is the very bad answer I'm giving, but there are certain things where we have to be very careful as writers. We know how easy it could be to get cancelled at a second's notice if you do something wrong. If you make a wrong decision in how you write a particular subject, there can be ramifications. So we do bear a responsibility, I think, as writers to get it right. So yeah, that's my bad answer.
Great answer. I'm going to talk about setting now, because Neil, you mentioned at the start you set out to write a tartan crime book, one set in Scotland. But Alex, you set a book right down the road from me, or a series of books possibly. In the first of a woman dies in a hotel room. And I know the hotel well. It was really near my last school. Is setting something that you thought about? Like, why did you choose Stockport for that novel?
Well, partly because I was living there at the time. It was my home territory at that point. But I think for me, setting is absolutely critical. And one reason I like setting that's the Moraine series, all set in and around Stockport and Greater Manchester generally. And I think the reason why I wanted to do that was because it felt to me like a setting lent itself to a whole range of different kinds of backdrops and stories. So some of the books are very rural and set up in up in the peaks. Some of them are much more urban and set in Manchester or Stockport and so on. I mean, that particular one, for me, what I was trying to write about in that book was really the sort of eeriness of hotels, which I always find hotels, even the most upmarket hotel, always strikes me as a slightly odd place where all these hundreds of people or dozens of people are all crammed into one place, all in their own individual rooms. And you don't know who's behind each door or what they're doing, or what sort of threat they might pose or whatever. So the germ of that book came from just different hotel settings, which range in the book from somewhere fairly sleazy through to somewhere fairly upmarket up in the Pennines or whatever. But each of them has their own different kind of threat. So for me, that was how that particular book worked. And I think as a series as a whole, I think it was because I could get that combination of different sort of backdrops and settings and so on. But I think all the series I've written have all been very much set in different places. So the Highland series is very much set where I now live. The Annie Delamere books are set in the Peak District and are very much about that. And again, the sort of combination of the very sort of chocolate boxy, Peak District villages alongside, the ex-mining towns and all those kind of things gives you that nice contrast in terms of backdrops and settings and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And Gytha, what about you? Did you think lots about setting beforehand, or was it in your mind where it would be set fairly straight away?
Yeah, I had a lot of thought about setting so when I started out, because the first book is so much based in sort of a feeling of nostalgia and sort of a loss of innocence with the original crime happening in 1983 to a group of teenagers and how it changes them. I really wanted the setting to feel nostalgic, and to me that meant it had to be one of very few places, and the New Forest was kind of the best one because I used to go there quite a lot. And it has that real feeling to me of somewhere which hasn't been really very touched for the large part of it. So that seemed perfect. And of course, the thing about that is, because it's a series, as soon as I'd set something in the New Forest, that then meant that I had all the crimes happening in Southampton and the New Forest, because that is in fact Jonah's patch. And once you do that, but you realise that obviously quite a lot of the crime is going to be in Southampton, you get a very different feel, because Southampton as a city is nothing like kind of the rural parts of the New Forest. So that's actually been a lot of fun. I get to switch between them sort of whenever I want, and I've very much used the two. So the second book is a much more modern book. It's all set sort of in the present with a lot of technology being used in it. So sort of A Murder on Skype is kind of the big starting point. And it's a much more city-orientated novel with CCTV happening as a big part of it, and a very different way of investigating as a result, because it's not a cold case. So it's actually been really good fun to have the two, and I feel quite lucky that I have the option. And in a way, of course, that my characters don't, because they have to take whatever's thrown at them by me.
The god of Southampton. Neil, what about you? What were so yours is set up in Scotland. So and sort of that was Novak's base, wasn't it? He went home to.
Yeah, no. Despite the fact Novak was Bosnian by birth, he was born just outside Sarajevo. He was brought up in the Scottish Highlands by foster family after his parents died, and so I always wanted to give him just a home base in Scotland. But really, the vast majority of those books was elsewhere. And I do really like giving myself the broadest of canvases to use, where I can go absolutely anywhere. With the Novaks, I went all over the world. The Dead Man's Grave, I wanted to be a Scottish book, but I used the whole of Scotland. I didn't say, I mean, obviously Ian Rankin got Edinburgh sewn up, and there are plenty of books written in Glasgow and places. But I wanted to have that broad canvas and to be able to go anywhere in Scotland. So I did. Gave him the sort of the whole of Scotland to play in. But I always bring something back to the Black Isle, almost inevitably, where I live, just because I love talking about the place. It's home, and I also think it's great to be able to touch in with your local readership and be able. And when you say, "Oh, look, there's a scene down the road in Och," and people love it, and maybe you might get a moan and say, "Are you turning us into Midsummer?" And with me and Mike both writing books on the Black Isle, we are turning the Black Isle into Midsummer. But no, I like it, and I very much wanted the Scottish landscape, the scenery, to be another character in the book. So I did set out to try and give it a sense of place, because I love this country so much that I really wanted to sort of celebrate it, the good and the bad, because there is an element of like duality in Scotland with you get the absolute beauty of the Highlands, but in 30 seconds time, you can be besieged by midges or the Har can come down and you can't see a thing. So, I wanted to give rise to that and to really celebrate that. So, yeah, it means an awful lot to me to be able to give a book a sense of place. And it's becoming more important, I think, the more I write.
Yeah, lovely. Tony Millington has said, Neil, have you heard of a Mongolian heavy metal band called, I'm going to say The Hue, because they couldn't be called The Who, could they, for copyright issues? So I'm guessing The Hue, and possibly something that you could put in your next book, traditional Mongolian music.
I'll add that.
One for your list. And Mike Craven wants to know what's in your T-shirt, Neil.
This is a T-shirt from a really terrific guy called Richie, who's got a little company called One of 100. Little plug for him there because he's a great guy. He's the one he did the Oxford Bar T-shirt for Ian Rankin, and he's got another one coming out soon. So you got to watch out for that because they'll sell out in about 30 seconds.
There you go. Really nice. Right. If the I'm going to say the crowd or the public's not the right answer either. If you're watching and you've got a question, please put it in the comments, and I will try and get to it. How do you deal with reviews that are less favourable? You're screwing up your face. Are they water off a duck's back at this stage, or do you still think bit annoying?
You're asking me. I you know what, I should be all magnanimous and say, well, you put yourself, but no, you can't help it, can you? None of us.
Nah.
We're all sensitive creatures, and I'm getting better. I'm tending not to read as many. I'm watching the numbers going up because we've all got the next figure that in terms of amount of reviews. So but I'm really trying hard not to review them because I do get annoyed with them occasionally. Yeah. Am I allowed to tell you about my favourite Australian review? I think I told you this before, Chris.
Go for it.
I can't. I apologise if anyone gets offended by this, but there was a review on Australian Amazon. This book was so great, it stopped me knocking one out in a house that I had to myself with unrestricted access to pornography. No one can beat that review.
Can anyone beat that review? Gytha, have you got one?
I'm afraid I can't. there's no beating that. No, I've been obviously delighted with good reviews, and in fact, I think I'm incredibly lucky in having started my career as a novelist, having been 7 years as a professional playwright, because you just get so used to feedback, and it just doesn't affect you in the same way after a while. And I think you just inevitably you see it more as a long-term thing, and you just see it as one review. And I always try and do the kind of the Graham Linehan quote and think, well, whether I agree with them or not, they're saying something that could be useful to me as feedback, and try and take the useful bit and not worry about the bit of you that kind of goes maybe a bit ouch about it. But I have to say, I mean my strong advice to anyone who wants to get toughened up before embarking on a career as a novelist is go into theatre, because bloody everybody will tell you their opinion. I mean, you produce a script, all the actors tell you whether they think it's going to work before they've even tried to say the line. Then you do rehearsals, you get a bit more of that. Then you might have an external director who will then tell you what they think, and then the lighting guy will tell you what he thinks, and then the audience will tell you, and then some critics, and then the lighting guy will tell you again at the end. Like, you're just deluged with the stuff, and I think it's great, because you just get to the point where you're like, yeah, that's fine, it's all okay. And so by the time I got to those first Amazon reviews, as sort of nervous as I was about the experience, it didn't feel devastating the first time someone gave me 1 star. And that's okay, because you can't please everyone all the time anyway, and I wouldn't want to try. Actually, I think that would lead to kind of very sort of insipid fiction. So I think it's been less painful than I would have anticipated.
Good. Yeah, that theatre definitely sounds hardening. Alex, what about you? 1 stars, how do you feel about them?
Well, I mean, I think I'm with Gytha. You have to recognise you can't please everybody. You're not going to please everybody. And again, I wouldn't want to either. I think if you're feeling bad about this, the thing I sometimes do is go and look at some of my favourite writers and look at their 1-star reviews. And you see people, some major writers like Ruth Rendell or Reginald Hill or someone getting these 1-star reviews, and you think, well, if they're going to get them, then so am I. That's you did that. I think for me, the most, you see some which are clear just your malicious. You see some, and I think these are the ones I sort of found most, in a way, most painful, but also most useful. The ones that really do offer you something that you think, oh yes, you're right. I did get that wrong. Or I could have done that better. I could have done that in a different kind of way. And those are the ones I think are most useful, but also probably in some ways the most painful to receive. I did get 1-star review which listed all the things I hated about my book, but all the characters, all the scenes I hated didn't appear in my book at all. So I've no idea
That's dreadful.
I did have a 5-star review once that said best belt I'd ever had. That was good. I'll take that. And I know I think Marion Todd's watching this now. She got one of my reviews and she won't give it back.
Maybe you can log onto the 3 o'clock panel and give her what for. This is obviously a police procedural panel, and we've talked a lot about it. Is there a different genre that you would like to have a go at if you haven't already? Gytha, if you could write another review, Marion, you're getting in my head here. If you could write a different genre, Gytha, what would you go for? What's burning your fingers?
See, I have trouble because I want to write quite a lot of genres. I actually write kids and YA. What I did before I'm having a hiatus at the moment, which I put on Wattpad, which I started doing just while I was waiting for me about the first crime book, the first grown-up book going out, and it was just great sort of distraction and a bit of positive feedback whilst that was all going on. So I've got a series for kids on there, and I've got then a sort of a standalone YA, which I might turn into a series as well. And I had great fun doing those. But I'd also, at some point, quite like to write something, I don't know, like literary, historical, something maybe a bit sci-fi. I don't know. These are all, because the trouble is when you've grown up reading so many different genres, you kind of want to have a dip into lots of them. And maybe my answer is just to mesh them all together. Why haven't I thought this before? So a kid's YA detective novel in which there are aliens would be amazing. Okay, that's now what I'm going to do. That's book 6, guys.
And Waterstones would have to put that on the front table because it doesn't fit into any one genre, so it's a good way forward.
Or in the bin, but either way, I'd be special. It's fine.
Yeah, PR out of it anyway. Neil, what about you? Any other genre?
I don't know really. I mean, if I'm really tempted to have a go at an espionage thriller, because I went through and started reading some of the Mick Herron books and I really enjoyed those. And Charles Cummings' book, Box 88. Hell of a good book, that. So there is a bit of me that fancies writing an espionage book, but I don't know if I can be bothered to do the research, really. I think it's the reality of that. I had a moment where I thought I might like to write. As we all remember, back in sort of 10 years ago, Tony Parsons wrote the book Man and Boy about the relationship between him and his son after a family breakdown. I just loved that book, and it's full of heart. And there was a part of me that thought, could I do something like that? Maybe something with a bit of emotion in it. I suspect I won't do it, but I do like things like that. I like to sometimes mix it up, but I don't know. And I could be tempted to go slightly down the historical route, but not too far down. I recently managed to get hold of my grandfather's police service record. He was in Liverpool City Police. We joined straight after the First World War, and I got some of his complaints and all sorts of stuff. And what a character, you know! And all around the worst part of Liverpool, he was policing in sort of 1919, around then onwards. All around Scotland Road and things like that. And that struck me as that could be something very cool to write about. A sort of a historical-ish type fiction based around that time but that would still be a crime novel or something. But some amazing stories to tell about that. I mean, I don't know if you've all heard, this is very important for me to say, by the way, police procedural, right? You need to understand, if you're dealing with cops will take every opportunity to draw a cock. Whether it's in someone's hat, whether it's in someone's notebook, anywhere, a cop will do this. Now, my grandfather had a complaint against him in 1919 for drawing a knob that the cleaners saw. And that is just the greatest thing I've ever heard in my life. It made me so proud of my grandfather. And so I have a little inkling and a thing that I might do that. Maybe when I've sort of like, you know, written a few more of these current series that I'm doing, maybe I might tackle that.
Amazing historical cocks. Alex, what about you? Is there an itch to scratch somewhere else?
Well, I have. I mean, funnily enough, I have written one kind of historical crime thriller which didn't feature any graffiti at all. That was set in 1947, sort of after the war in East Anglia, called Winterman, which is actually probably the book I'm most proud of, actually, as a novel. I think I was really pleased with it, but it made very little impact on anybody, so I've not really followed it up since then. But I'd like to do more of those one day. I'm sort of in the middle of actually writing a sort of what is a sort of spoof espionage thriller at the moment, which I'm doing really, I think, mainly for myself. I'm not ever going to try and get it published, but it's something I'm just enjoying writing. I'll see where it goes at the end of it. Just a bit of a sort of refreshment between the sort of last two procedurals I've been writing and the next one that's coming along. I've also got a sort of science fiction novel that's sort of half written, and which one day I may get back round to do again. So I think there are lots of things I'd quite like to do. I mean, part of the trouble is you end up sort of almost on a bit of a, you know, sort of treadmill is the wrong word, because it's unpleasant, but you know, you want to do the next in the series, as it were, that you're currently writing, and so there's always that pressure. But I think between those, there are one or two areas I'd quite like to explore, I think.
Yeah, brilliant. And then back to what you are writing. So can you tell us a little bit about what is coming next from you? Neil, let's start with you. What's coming next?
Well, I'm obviously of a 3-book contract with HQ, and I've written those 3 books. The obviously Dead Man's Grave is out now. It comes out in hardback next month, and it's out in ebook and audio now, then hardback on the 16th of September. That's then followed up with the Blood Tide, which is Max Craigie 2. That's out in February. And the 3rd book in the series is written, and it is currently sat in my editor's inbox now, waiting for him to tell me what he thinks of it. So those 3 are written, and I'm at that kind of a crossroads where I haven't got a contract to write any more books at the moment. I'm pretty confident one's going to come. I have a very good idea for Max Craigie 4. I also have a really good idea for Tom Novak 4. So I haven't put pen to paper yet. I am having a bit of time off because I did write 3 books in a year, which was a bit too much, if I'm honest, and it did sort of fry my brain towards the end. So yeah, that's where I currently am.
Brilliant. So the Blood Tide February next year.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Look forward to that. The first one was brilliant. Gytha, what about you? What's coming next?
that? Okay, not unmuted myself. Am I unmuted now? Is that better?
Oh, yeah, we can hear you.
There we go. I was just realising it was a bit noisy here because people were justifiably having their coffees chatting. So I was trying to unmute myself. So now try again. So I just finished book 4 in the Jonas Sheen series. Just waiting for copy edits. So I've been cracking on with book 5. Book 4 comes out in April in hardback, and it's called Little Sister, and I'm very much looking forward to it. It's a little different from the first 3, but still a Jonas Sheen's crime, and I'll have a cover release soon. Book 5 I'm starting to get my acting gear with, which is always that nice bit when you get about 20,000 words in. And of course, apparently I'm now doing book 6 a mashup of genres, but I would love to write a second book this year. This is where Neil makes me feel incredibly lazy, because I write 1 book a year, and I'm like, oh, two would be a bit of a push, wouldn't it? But I would love to, because I've been very keen to write a sort of a standalone on the side for some while, and I'd really like to try and squeeze it in. So we'll see how that goes. I might need to get off Facebook if that's going to happen. But yeah, we'll see which the bigger draw is when it comes to it.
But I think a standalone's such a lovely idea. Did you get entrenched with these characters that you know so well, and sometimes it's nice just to have a little break from them and explore something
isn't
else.
It? Like a little palate cleanser.
Yeah, yeah. Alex, what about you? What's coming next from you?
Well, I've got 2 books sort of in the pipeline. There's the next in my Kelly Moraine series out, actually by some amazing coincidence, this coming Wednesday, the 1st of September. And that's called Life Remains. And that, I think, for anybody who's following the series, will be quite an interesting one, because the last book ended on something of a shock, and this book, although it's written as a standalone book, kind of continues the story from where the last book left off. So I hope that'll sort of interest at least those who are following the series to date. And then I've got the next in the Annie Delamere series, which is kind of written and ready to go, and is due out next February. So that's called Bad Terms, and will be out then. And then I'm sort of, I mean, I'm like Neil. I do tend to write a lot and write fairly prolifically, you know. So I've got this other book I'm writing now, which I've nearly finished, and then I'll be on to the next. Probably the next Alex Mackay book is the next thing to come along, which I imagine will be out next year sometime, depending on the time scales. But I've got that sort of plotted in my head, at least in broad terms. So that's the next thing to come along, I think.
Brilliant. Loads to look forward to. So that's this Wednesday, you said your next one?
This Wednesday, 1st September, Life Remains. It's the 5th in the Kelly Moraine series.
Lovely. Really nice. And we're almost out of time, and I always love to end it when we do our podcast with finding out what people are reading. So, Neil, what are you reading at the minute?
I haven't started a new book, but I very, very recently on audio read Razorblade Tears by S.A. Crosby. It blew me away. What a book. What an amazing voice. And before that, I'd read Blacktop Wasteland as well. So I literally bounced one to the other. Both absolutely fantastic. I completely recommend them both.
Yeah, I just finished Blacktop Wasteland a few books ago, and I absolutely loved it. Yeah, massive talent. Gytha, what are you reading at the minute?
I've unmuted myself this time. So I thought I was going to read loads on holiday because I went to Mallorca, and I actually managed to read absolutely nothing because everyone was hanging out together the entire time. So it was great fun, but I'm therefore a page into the new Lisa Jewell, which is called When She Disappeared, or The Night She Disappeared. And I bet it's great. But at the present moment, I couldn't say much more about it. I'm also sort of half reading lots of different books, which I think I've just managed to put in silly places, like My Other Half's House, because this happens to me quite a bit. All of which seem good. So it's Karen Hamilton's The Ex-Husband. I know it's one of them, and I was enjoying that till I lost it. And there'll be a few like that. But they're all crime at the moment, except for the Tamora Pierces that I'm reading my 10-year-old at night. So yeah.
Really nice.
Alex, what are you reading?
Well, I'm actually indulging myself at the moment because I've just got hold of all the books by a guy called Colin Watson, who was a sort of crime writer in the 70s, early 80s, who I think has been largely forgotten, but the books have been republished quite recently, and they're sort of almost like spoof cozy crime novels set in East Anglia, which deal a lot with sort of a very satirical, sort of cynical approach to so things like local politics and sort of local government and so on. And the books I read first, back when they were originally published, and I've just got hold of the whole session, just plowing my way through those at the moment, and they're as good as ever. They've really held up, and I thought they might seem a bit dated and old-fashioned, but they really don't. I mean, all the political issues they deal with are all the kinds of things that you can recognise from today. So I thoroughly recommend those to anyone who's not come across them.
Brilliant. I'm on Dom Nolan's Vine Street, which Neil, if you're talking about historical police work, that's set over a range of times, but mostly in 1935 in Soho, and it's up there with my books of the year. I'm about halfway through, and it's so good. The man's a talented man, and nice as well. Which fair play to him. It's been an hour, and it's been really, really fun. I realised it was very short notice for two of you. So thank you so much for coming and making it such a delight and easy to do. So
it's been great fun. Thanks so much, Chris.
It's been really nice. For the UK Crime Book Club and the people in the audience, there's loads more going on today. So at 3 o'clock, there's Celtic Crime. At 5 o'clock, there's Gangland Crime. And then at 7, some chap, Mike Craven, is talking to William Shaw, which promises to be a great chat. So there's a lovely day there ahead of you. So you've got an hour to go and eat, and then come back and have fun the rest of today. Thank you so much for joining in, and we will see you
everyone.
Again.
So much.
Bye-bye.